"Please don't die tonight," whispered Widow. Cowboy held her until dawn. The revolver hit the dirt with a sound that silenced the wind. For a moment, nothing moved. Not the cottonwoods by the creek. Not the buzzards circling overhead. Not even the dust that hung in the air like something waiting to settle but never would. She stood there, arms still outstretched, palms empty now. The gun lay between them, hers and his, a thing that had done what it was made to do. Her hands were shaking, so hard she couldn't make them stop. Tears cut clean lines down her face, through the dust and the heat and the weight of what she'd just done. The cowboy was on his knees in front of her, one hand pressed to his side where the blood was already soaking through his shirt. His breathing came in short, shallow pulls. His hat had fallen off somewhere in the chaos. His eyes, gray as storm clouds, met hers, and she saw no judgment there. Only something quiet, something that looked like understanding. But it wasn't his blood on her hands. The man who killed her husband lay 10 feet away, face down in the dry grass by the creek bed. His gun was still in his holster. He never got the chance to draw it. She had been faster. 3 days ago, the cowboy had ridden into her failing ranch with nothing but a worn saddle, a tired horse, and a name she thought she'd buried 6 years back. He didn't say much that first day, just asked if she had work. She almost said no. The ranch was dying, fences falling, cattle gone, the well running low. She had no money to pay a hand. But something in the way he stood there, hat in his hands, made her pause. "I can work for food," he'd said quietly. "And a place to sleep that ain't the ground." She'd nodded. What else could she do? He worked harder than any man she'd ever seen. Fixed the fence line. Cleared the irrigation ditch. Didn't talk much, but he didn't need to. His presence was steady, solid, like something she could lean against if the world got too heavy. On the second night, she asked him his name. "Caleb," he said. Her breath caught. She set down the coffee pot too hard. It clattered against the stove. "Caleb what?" she whispered. He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw the truth in his eyes before he even said it. Caleb Mercer. The name landed like a stone in still water. Mercer. The same last name as the man who had ridden onto her land 5 years ago, charmed her late husband into a cattle deal, then vanished with half their herd and all their savings. The same man who had left them broken. The same man her husband had ridden out to find and never came home from. She should have thrown him out, should have reached for the shotgun by the door. But something stopped her. "Are you kin to him?" she asked, voice barely steady. "My brother," Caleb said. "And I've been looking for him ever since." The honesty in his voice unraveled something in her chest. That was 2 nights ago. This morning, his brother had finally come. She'd been pulling water from the well when she saw the rider coming up the trail. Caleb had been in the barn, shoeing her last remaining horse. She didn't recognize the man at first, older now, harder, but when he dismounted and smiled that same crooked smile, her stomach turned to ice. "Well now," he'd said, tipping his hat. "Didn't think I'd ever see this place again." She hadn't moved, hadn't breathed. And then Caleb stepped out of the barn. The 2 brothers stood facing each other across the yard. The resemblance was undeniable. Same build, same jaw, same storm gray eyes. But everything else was different. Caleb stood quiet and still, like a man who'd learned to carry his shame without letting it break him. His brother stood loose and grinning, like a man who'd never felt shame at all. "Caleb," the older Mercer said, shaking his head. "You still chasing me?" "I came to make it right," Caleb said. His brother laughed. "Ain't nothing to make right. I took what I could carry. That's the West, little brother. You're just too soft to see it." "You stole from good people," Caleb said. "You killed her husband." The widow's heart stopped. "He got away," his brother said, shrugging. "Drew on me first. I was just faster." It was a lie. She knew it. Her husband had never been a fast draw. He'd been a rancher, a father, a man who believed in second chances. Caleb's hand drifted toward his gun. "Don't," his brother said, voice dropping low. "You ain't fast enough, Caleb. You never were." But the widow had already moved. She slipped into the house, quiet as breath, and pulled her husband's revolver from the drawer where it had sat untouched for 5 years. When she came back outside, Caleb and his brother were still standing there, the space between them shrinking. "Walk away," Caleb said. "Or what?" his brother sneered. "You'll shoot your own blood?" "If I have to." His brother's hand twitched toward his holster, and the widow raised the gun and fired. The shot cracked across the valley like thunder. The older Mercer stumbled, eyes wide with shock, and fell. Caleb had lunged forward to stop her, or maybe to shield her, and the second man who'd been hiding by the creek, a partner she hadn't seen, fired from the shadows. The bullet caught Caleb in the side, and he went down hard. She fired again. The second man dropped. And then there was only silence. Now kneeling beside him in the dust, she pressed her hands against the wound in his side. Blood pulsed hot and steady between her fingers. His face had gone pale. His breathing was too shallow. "I'm sorry," she whispered, voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." He shook his head, just barely. "You saved me." "No," she said. Tears fell onto his shirt, mixing with the blood. "You came here to make it right." "And you did what you had to," he said. His hand found hers, grip weak but sure. "Ain't your fault." She looked at him. This man who'd carried his brother's sins like a weight on his back, who'd worked her land for nothing, who tried to fix what couldn't be fixed. And she realized she didn't want him to leave. Not now. Not ever. "Please," she whispered, the words torn from somewhere deep. "Please don't die tonight." His eyes held hers, and for a moment, the world went still. "I'll try," he said. She pulled him to his feet, and together they stumbled toward the house, leaving the guns and the bodies and the ghosts behind them in the dust. The fever took him just after midnight. She'd gotten him into the house, onto the bed in the small back room where her husband used to sleep when the night work ran late. The bullet had torn through muscle and flesh but missed anything vital, or so she prayed. She'd cleaned the wound with whiskey and hot water, wrapped it tight with strips torn from her last good sheet, and pressed her palm against his chest to feel his heartbeat. It was still there, faint but steady. Now, 3 hours later, he was burning up. She sat beside him in the dim glow of a single candle, a wet cloth in her hand, wiping the sweat from his forehead. His skin was hot as a stoveplate. His breathing came rough and uneven. Every few minutes, he'd mutter something she couldn't make out, names, maybe, or places. Words from a life she didn't know. She wrung out the cloth in a basin of cool water and pressed it to his neck. His eyes moved beneath his closed lids, lost somewhere deep in the fever's grip. "Stay with me," she whispered. "Please." But he didn't answer. The room felt too small, too quiet. She glanced toward the window, where the first pale light of dawn was still hours away, and felt the weight of the night pressing down on her shoulders like stones. She'd killed 2 men today. The thought sat in her chest like something cold and permanent. She'd pulled the trigger twice, and twice men had fallen. One of them had stolen everything from her. The other had been his shadow, and she felt no guilt, only a hollow, aching relief that it was over. But Caleb had paid the price for her vengeance. Her eyes drifted to the corner of the room, where his saddlebag lay slumped against the wall. He'd dropped it when she'd helped him inside, and it had fallen open, spilling a few of its contents onto the floor. A tin cup, a folding knife, a small leather pouch that smelled faintly of tobacco, and a letter. It had slipped halfway out of an inner pocket, the envelope yellowed and creased from years of being carried. She could see the edge of faded handwriting on the front. She shouldn't look. It wasn't hers to read. But something pulled at her, some quiet instinct that said the letter mattered, that it might tell her who this man really was, and why he'd come to her ranch carrying a name that had haunted her for 5 long years. She stood slowly, crossed to the saddlebag, and knelt beside it. Her fingers trembled as she pulled the letter free. The envelope was soft as cloth, worn thin from handling. On the front, in careful, slanted script, were the words, "To my son, Caleb. When you are ready to come home." Her breath caught. She turned the envelope over. It had never been sealed. The flap was tucked inside, as if it had been opened and read 100 times. She hesitated, glancing back at the bed where Caleb lay fevered and still. Then she slipped the letter out and unfolded it. The paper was thin, nearly translucent, and the ink had faded to a pale gray. But the words were still legible, written in the same careful hand as the envelope. My dearest boy, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't know if you're still alive, or if the world has taken you the way it took your father. But I write it anyway, because a mother's love doesn't stop just because her child is gone. You were 16 when you left. You said you couldn't stay in a place that felt so small that you needed to see what was beyond the canyon walls. I understood. I did. But I also knew the West is hard, and it doesn't forgive the young or the reckless. I waited for you. Every day, I looked down the road, hoping to see you riding back. Your brother came home once, 2 years after you left, but he didn't stay long. He said you'd gone north, chasing work on the cattle drives. He said you were doing fine, but I didn't believe him. I know my boys, and I know when one is running from something he can't name. Caleb, if you ever come back, you'll find me here, on this ranch, in this house, waiting. There's always a place for you at this table, always a bed, always forgiveness. I don't care what you've done or where you've been. You're still my son. Come home when you're ready. With all my love. Mama, the widow's hands shook as she read the last line again. Come home when you're ready. She looked up at Caleb, lying fevered and pale in the bed, and something inside her chest cracked open. He'd been carrying this letter for 20 years. 20 years of wandering, of drifting from town to town, of trying to outrun the guilt of leaving. And all the while, his mother had waited here, on this ranch, in this house. The widow's house now. She'd bought the property 6 years ago, after she and her husband had saved every penny they could scrape together. The previous owner had been an older woman, quiet, kind, but worn down by loneliness. She'd sold the ranch for far less than it was worth, saying she didn't have the strength to keep it anymore. She'd moved into town, into a small boarding house, and died less than a year later. The widow had never known her name, but now, looking at the letter, she understood. Caleb's mother had waited here until she couldn't wait anymore. She'd sold the ranch, the place she'd promised her son would always be his home, and left. Not because she'd given up on him, but because the land had taken everything she had left to give. And Caleb had come back too late. The widow pressed the letter to her chest and closed her eyes. Tears slipped down her cheeks, hot and silent. He hadn't ridden onto her land by chance. He'd come looking for his mother, for the home he'd abandoned, for the forgiveness she'd promised him in faded ink on fragile paper. But the house belonged to someone else now, and his mother was gone. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into the envelope, then set it on the small table beside the bed. Her hand moved to Caleb's forehead. The fever was still burning, but his breathing had steadied just a little. She waited for you, the widow whispered. She never stopped waiting. Caleb's eyes moved beneath his lids, and his lips parted slightly, as if he were trying to speak. But no words came. She dipped the cloth into the basin again and laid it across his forehead. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and sending dust skittering across the porch. The night felt vast and empty, stretching out in all directions like an ocean made of darkness. But here, in this small room, there was warmth. There was breath. There was the faint, stubborn beat of a heart that refused to quit. She pulled the chair closer to the bed and sat down, her hand resting lightly on his arm. You came home, she said softly. Maybe not the way you hoped, but you're here. And as the candle burned low and the night deepened around them, she made a silent promise, not to his mother, but to him. If he lived through this, she wouldn't let him leave alone. He woke just after midnight, shaking so hard the bed frame rattled. She'd been dozing in the chair beside him, her head tilted against the wall, when the sound jolted her awake. His eyes were open, wide and unfocused, and his breath came in short, panicked gasps like a man drowning in shallow water. Caleb, she said, leaning forward. Her hand found his. It was ice cold despite the fever that had burned through him all day. Caleb, I'm here. He turned his head toward her voice, but it took a moment for his eyes to find her face. When they did, something in them cracked. Not relief. Something deeper. Something that looked like fear. "I'm cold," he whispered. His voice was barely a rasp, dry and broken. "Why am I so cold?" She stood quickly, pulled the quilt from the foot of the bed, and draped it over him, tucking it around his shoulders. But even as she did, she could feel him trembling beneath the layers, a shaking that came from somewhere deeper than skin and bone. "The fever's breaking," she said softly. "That's why you're cold. It's a good sign." But he didn't seem to hear her. His hand gripped hers with a strength she didn't think he still had, and his eyes searched her face like he was looking for something he'd lost a long time ago. "I dreamed about her," he said. The widow went still. "Who?" "My mother." His voice cracked on the word, and she saw the tears begin to gather at the corners of his eyes. He didn't try to hide them. "She was standing in the doorway," he said. "Right there." He nodded weakly toward the door at the end of the room. She was waiting, like she always said she would. The widow's throat tightened. She thought of a letter, still sitting on the table beside the bed. She'd read it 3 more times while he'd been fevered and lost, trying to understand the woman who'd written it, the woman who'd lived in this house, who'd loved this man when he was still a boy. She did wait, the widow said quietly. For a long time. Caleb closed his eyes, and a tear slipped down his temple into his hair. "I know. I found out 2 years ago. Asked around in town. They told me she'd moved. Told me she died." His breath hitched. "I was too late." "You came anyway," she said. "I had to." He opened his eyes again, and they were full of something raw and aching. "I had to see it. The place she talked about in her letter. The place she said would always be home." The widow's chest tightened. She wanted to tell him she understood, that she knew what it felt like to lose someone and spend the rest of your life trying to find your way back to them. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she held his hand tighter. "I read the letter," she said softly. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have, but it's all right," he said. He squeezed her hand weakly. "You needed to know." They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the faint whistle of wind slipping through the cracks in the walls. The candle on the table had burned low, casting long shadows across the room. "I left when I was 16, Caleb said. His voice was steadier now, but still quiet. "Thought I was going to see the world. Thought I'd come back rich and prove I was worth something." He let out a bitter, breathless laugh. "But the world don't care what you're worth. It just takes and takes until there's nothing left." She didn't interrupt. She just listened. "I worked cattle drives up north," he continued. "Broke horses for a rancher in Montana. Rode with a crew out of Cheyenne for a while." He paused, and his jaw tightened. "And I rode with my brother for longer than I should have." The widow's stomach turned cold. "He was always the one with the big ideas," Caleb said. "Always knew how to make money fast. And I was young and stupid enough to follow him." His voice dropped. "I didn't pull a trigger. But I was there. I watched him take from good people. Watched him lie and cheat and leave families with nothing." He turned his head away, staring up at the ceiling. "I told myself I'd leave, that I'd walk away and make it right. But I was scared. Scared of being alone. Scared of what he'd do if I turned on him." "But you did leave," the widow said. "Not soon enough." His voice was thick with shame. "By the time I finally walked away, he'd already done enough damage for both of us. And I spent the next 10 years trying to outrun it." She could hear the weight in his words, the years of guilt and regret piled so high he could barely stand under them. "That's why you came here," she said. "Not just for your mother, but to make it right." He nodded. "When I heard what he'd done to you and your husband, I knew I had to find him. Had to stop him." He looked at her, and his eyes were full of something desperate and broken. "But you stopped him. Not me. You did what I couldn't." "You tried," she said. "That's more than most would do." He shook his head. "It wasn't enough." "It was," she said firmly. "You came here carrying his sins like they were yours. You worked this land for nothing. You stood up to him when it mattered." Her voice softened. "You took a bullet meant for me. Don't tell me that wasn't enough." His breath caught, and he looked at her like he didn't know what to do with her words. Like kindness was a language he'd forgotten how to speak. "I don't deserve this," he whispered. "I don't deserve you sitting here, taking care of me." "Maybe not," she said. "But I'm here anyway." Silence settled between them again, but this time it felt different. Softer. Like something fragile was being built in the space where words couldn't reach. After a long moment, Caleb turned his head to look at her fully. His hand was still in hers, and she could feel the trembling beginning to ease. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes." He hesitated, and she saw the fear flicker across his face again, the fear of a man who'd been turned away too many times to expect anything different. "If I live," he said slowly, "would you let me stay?" The question hung in the air like smoke. She looked at him, this cowboy who'd carried a 20-year-old letter in his saddlebag, who'd come looking for a home that didn't exist anymore, who'd bled in her dust trying to undo his brother's wrongs. And she realized she didn't want him to leave. Not because she needed help with the ranch. Not because she was lonely. But because somewhere in the last 3 days, she'd started to see him not as a stranger or a ghost of the past, but as someone who understood what it meant to lose everything and still keep breathing. She didn't answer with words. Instead, she reached for the quilt and pulled it higher around his shoulders, smoothing it gently across his chest. Then she let her tears fall, slow and quiet, where he could see them. "Rest," she said softly. He closed his eyes, and for the first time since the fever had taken him, his breathing came easy. She stayed beside him, her hand still holding his, and watched as the night deepened around them. The candle burned lower. The wind outside settled into a whisper. And somewhere beyond the walls, the sky began its slow turn toward morning. She didn't know what dawn would bring. Didn't know if the world would let them have this. Two broken people finding something soft in the hard edges of survival. But for now, in the darkness, she made a promise she didn't speak aloud. If he stayed, she wouldn't let him carry his shame alone anymore. He was still breathing when the sun came up. She'd watched through the night, dozing in fits between checking his pulse and laying cool cloths on his forehead. But sometime around dawn, when the first pale light began to seep through the window, his eyes opened. Clear this time, no fever clouding them. And he looked at her like a man waking from a long, dark dream. "You stayed," he said. His voice was rough, barely more than a whisper. "I did," she said. He closed his eyes again, and she saw his chest rise and fall in a long, steady breath. Relief. Or maybe something deeper than that. "Thank you," he said. She didn't answer, just squeezed his hand once and stood to open the window. The morning air rolled in cool and clean, carrying the smell of dust and sage and the faint sweetness of the cottonwoods down by the creek. The world outside was waking up. Birds called from the trees. The sky stretched wide and gold above the canyon walls. And for the first time in days, the ranch felt quiet in a way that didn't hurt. She turned back to him. "Can you sit up?" He nodded, and she helped him ease himself upright, moving slow and careful. He winced when the bandage pulled at his side, but he didn't complain. Just sat there on the edge of the bed, head bowed, hands resting on his knees like a man learning how to hold his own weight again. "I'll make coffee," she said. "I'd like that." She left him there and walked into the kitchen. The stove was cold, so she built a fire from kindling and watched the flames catch and grow. The coffee pot was old and dented, the same one her husband had used every morning before the sun came up. She filled it with water from the bucket by the door and set it on the stove to heat. While she waited, she looked around the kitchen, the table where she'd eaten alone for 5 years, the shelf where her husband's favorite cup still sat, unused, the window that looked out over the yard, where she'd stood so many mornings watching the road for riders who never came. It felt different now. Not empty. Just waiting. When the coffee was ready, she poured 2 cups and carried them back to the room. Caleb was standing now, one hand braced against the wall for balance. He'd pulled on his shirt, blood-stained and torn, but still his, and was buttoning it slowly, like even that small task took more strength than he had. "You should rest," she said. "I've rested enough," he said. He looked at her, and something in his eyes was different. Steadier. I need to move. Need to see the sun. She handed him the coffee, and he took it with both hands, holding it like it was something precious. They stood there for a moment in silence, sipping the hot, bitter brew, and then she led him out through the house and onto the porch. The morning was perfect. Cool, but not cold. Bright, but not harsh. The kind of day that felt like a gift after too many hard ones. Caleb lowered himself into the chair by the door, the same chair her husband used to sit in after a long day's work, and leaned back with a slow exhale. She sat beside him on the steps, her own cup cradled in her hands. They didn't speak. Didn't need to. The ranch spread out before them. The barn with its sagging roof, the corral where her last horse stood watching them with lazy eyes, the fields that had gone dry and brown from lack of rain. It wasn't much, but it was hers. And for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like a burden. After a while, Caleb set his cup down and looked at her. I meant what I said last night, he said quietly. About staying. If you'll have me. She turned to him, and the morning light caught the lines of his face, the stubble on his jaw, the tiredness around his eyes, the faint scar above his left brow that she hadn't noticed before. You don't owe me anything, she said. I know, he said, but that's not why I'm asking. She studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any trace of doubt or dishonesty. But all she saw was a man who'd spent 20 years running and was finally tired enough to stop. Then stay, she said simply. He nodded once, slow and solemn, like she just handed him something he'd forgotten how to hold. I'll earn my keep, he said. I'll work the land. Fix what's broken. I won't be a burden. I know you won't. He looked out at the ranch again, and she saw the way his gaze moved over everything. The fences, the fields, the hills beyond. Like he was memorizing it. Like he was already making plans. That fence by the north pasture, he said. It's falling down. I know. I'll fix it today. You're still healing, she said. It can wait. I'd rather work, he said. Sitting still makes me think too much. She understood that. She'd spent 5 years keeping her hands busy, so her mind wouldn't drown in all the things she'd lost. All right, she said. But don't push yourself too hard. He smiled, just a little, but it was the first real smile she'd seen from him. Yes, ma'am. They finished their coffee in silence, and then he stood, slow and careful, and walked down the steps into the yard. She watched him cross to the barn, favoring his wounded side, but moving with purpose. He found the toolbox her husband had left behind, rusted hammers and bent nails and coils of wire that hadn't been touched in years, and carried it out to the north fence line. She stayed on the porch for a while, just watching him work, watching the way he moved, deliberate and steady, like a man who knew how to fix things that were broken. And then she went inside and started baking bread. She hadn't baked in months, maybe longer, but today it felt right. She mixed flour and water and salt, kneaded the dough until her hands ached, and set it to rise by the window. The smell filled the kitchen, warm and yeasty and alive, and it reminded her of mornings from another life, when the house had been full of noise and hope. By afternoon, the bread was golden and steaming on the table. Caleb came in smelling like sweat and dust, his shirt damp and his face flushed from the heat. He'd wrapped the wound fresh with a strip of cloth from his saddlebag, and though she could see the strain in his movements, he didn't complain. Fence is fixed, he said. Good, she said. Sit. Eat. He washed his hands in the basin by the door and sat at the table. She sliced the bread and set it in front of him with butter and a jar of preserves she'd made last summer from wild plums. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, and she sat across from him with her own slice, watching the way the light came through the window and made everything look softer. When the meal was finished, they sat in silence again. But this time, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt like rest. I buried the guns, he said after a while. Down by the creek, under the cottonwood. She nodded. She'd been meaning to do that herself, but hadn't been able to bring herself to touch them. And the letter, she said. Your mother's letter. I put it in a tin box on the mantel. If you want it. I do, he said. But I don't need to carry it anymore. She understood. That evening, as the sun began to sink behind the canyon walls, she stepped out onto the porch and found him standing by the corral, one hand resting on the fence rail, looking out at the land. His horse stood nearby, saddled and ready, but he wasn't moving toward it. She walked over and stood beside him. "You could still go," she said quietly, "if you wanted to." He shook his head. "I don't want to." And that was all he said. They stood there together as the sky turned orange and pink and purple, and the shadows grew long across the fields. The wind picked up, warm and gentle, carrying the smell of earth and grass and the distant promise of rain. For the first time in 20 years, Caleb didn't saddle his horse and ride away. And for the first time since her husband died, the widow didn't stand alone watching the road. The ranch held something new that night, something fragile and uncertain, but real. The sound of two people choosing not to leave.